races of Europe were the first to begin categorizing people by color. It was used as the basic discriminator of humans in the Eurocentric worldview of man. All other traits, whether physical, mental, cultural, or psychological, depended on skin color. Because Europeans equated white skin with superiority, they believed that they were biologically superior and therefore had the right to rule. We are continuing our discussion about the fourth beast from Daniel's vision, and right now we're focusing on the religion and the people. In the session today, we'll look at the Germanic Nordic races. Just know that the information may be sensitive for some. However, we're dealing with lies that were used to brainwash our people in an attempt to dehumanize them. And it's time to dismantle those lies. A lot of these falsehoods are still being preached from pulpits today, even in so-called black churches. Imagine that.
Black people got a problem. Now we can move to color blindness and always look at the man by the content of his character, never the color of his skin. I'm down for that. You get my vote. Yay and amen. I'm for that. But before we get there, we need to hear some truth. Black people and white folk. Black people got a problem. And it's a God problem. When black people see the world, I don't care. You can train them. You can train a black man to be a physician. You can train him to be an astrophysicist. You can train him to be a lawyer, but you can't train him to understand the world. He doesn't know. I'm telling you. There's not 2 cents worth of difference between a mass murderer. There's not 2 cents of difference between a petty thief that's locked away in prison than a black doctor when it comes to understanding the world. Listen, you listen to me. We got to deal with this. And we need to begin to acknowledge it, talk about it, ask God to help us, because only God can help black people where they are. Black people had Africa, that big old continent over there. They never built one boat that was seaworthy. Not one. There's not one monument in Africa, in all of Africa. I know you're talking about Egypt. Egypt is not Africa. There are no great cities that were built. Even before the first colonization of white people coming to the shores of Africa or the slave ships, black men built nothing. No sewer system, no houses above one level, and none of them made out of stone, all of them made out of grass and wood. Black men, before the white man ever got to Africa. The worst thing that could ever happen to South Africa was when they gave it to Nelson Mandela and black folk. That was a great nation. Now, notwithstanding apartheid was wrong, we all know it's wrong. I'm against it. There should have been some other resolution, though, than turning it over to Nelson Mandela. Disease, AIDS, and crime is running wild in Johannesburg. They're killing one another over there. They're dying of sickness. The government is mismanaged. The people who ran the nation are now leaving the nation because black folk don't know how to run no nation.
The brainwashing is real, folks. It's the continuation of racist propaganda. The truth is, Europeans are moving to the continent in droves. But if you let Europeans tell it, we would still be running around naked and swinging from trees. The uninformed among us still believe that we should be thankful that Europeans brought us the gospel. Basically, they did us a favor. Do you see why these lies have to be exposed? In times past, many of us didn't know how to respond to messages like that, so we didn't push back. Well, now we know the truth, and we are pushing back hard. No more will we remain silent. We have to expose the lies, whether folks are uncomfortable or not. If you're uncomfortable when you hear truth, good. It should lead you to repentance. If not, then you're a tare. and the fire awaits you. So just know that I have an assignment, and I know who I was sent to. Gentiles can benefit from the information shared here, but the focus is on the seed of Jacob first. So in this session, we will be talking about a people who considered themselves to be superior to all other races, especially the dark melanated people. This National Library of Medicine article says, by late medieval times, blackness conjured a picture of evil or something inherently defective, undesirable, or mysterious when contrasted with whiteness or lightness, which was associated with goodness, desirability, and honesty. Honesty. Just pause and think on that one. So I'll drop down to where it says that the color-based classification of Linnaeus, Buffon, and Kant demonstrated an inarticulate subscription to a system of thought which assumed that what was different, especially that which is black, was or embodied evil, inferiority, and moral negation of white, light, and goodness. Here's the thing. They never considered that they were the ones who presented a deviation from the norm. No, they automatically assumed that it had to be the other people, the brown people, who were strange or different. In the last session, I shared a snippet from this book that was written in 1899 called Races of Europe, a Sociological Study. But I want to delve deeper into it because the author, who was an economist and racial anthropologist, believed that race was critical to understanding human history. I agree. But there has been a concerted effort to hide or whitewash the truth about race. But those days are over. It's now time to learn the truth. In the introduction, the author says, it is to be observed that the Teutonic Nordics, who were to found the great Anglo-Saxon, German, French, and Scandinavian civilizations, and who stimulated the Italian Restoration, were actually the last of the Aryan folk to step out of their role as forest barbarians and aspire to the heights of destiny. Now, why would he refer to them as barbarians if it wasn't true? And can I just say here that usually when you see words like they founded something or they were the founders, it's code for they found something that belonged to others, they took it and made it theirs. It goes on to say, this strengthens us in the view that these Nordic folk were even in prehistoric times potentially great, and that they may have developed a culture which they had no time to record for posterity in the midst of their death grapple with the Mongoloids. Thus it was the Nordic tribes who acted as the rear guard for the pre-Teutonic Nordics who first claimed Europe for civilization. And it was these same vigorous Nordic barbarians who, under their great leader Charlemagne, at last flung back the Muslim hordes and saved Europe for Christianity, and who set up a frontier of feudal states between the Adriatic and the Baltic that developed into the outposts of the Holy Roman Empire. It goes on to tell us that the struggles between the Nordic and the Mediterranean and Semitic races lasted thousands of years. But it says when the Nordics burst into Western Europe, they found the Alpine population stretching to the Atlantic and the Mediterranean folk occupying all Spain, southern France, and Italy. These Nordics appear to have gravitated toward the warmer climes in considerable numbers. but it is a significant fact that wherever they conquered, their blood was soon lost in the more perfectly acclimated strain of the exploited folk. Did you catch that? Wherever they conquered, their blood was soon lost in the more perfectly acclimated strain of the exploited people. So they literally bred themselves out and became the people they conquered. Continuing, it says, obscure traces of Nordic blood are found even among the savage Kurds. But such ethnic remnants are unimportant when we consider the vast masses of Mediterraneans that now populate southern Europe, North Africa, and the Levant. It says there have obviously been some changes in the ethnic character of Europe since the day when the Pilgrims landed in America 3 centuries ago. The drain on the Nordic stock of the various countries of Western Europe has been prodigious, no doubt, both from destructive wars and by the immigration of Nordics from the homeland. Now he says we may demonstrate the innate tendency of the Teutonic peoples toward tallness of stature more locally than by his continental method. We may follow the trait from place to place as this migratory race has moved across the map. Wherever these greasy 7-foot giants, as Sidonius Apollinaris called them, have gone, they have implanted their stature upon the people, where it has remained long persistent thereafter. So he says perhaps the clearest detailed illustration of a persistency of this racial peculiarity is offered by the people of Brittany or Britain. He says we have always been taught since the days of Tacitus to regard the Teutonic peoples, the Goths, Lombards, and Saxons, as tawny-haired, large-limbed giants. History is filled with observations to that effect from the earliest times. Our maps have already led us to infer as much. Nevertheless, direct observations show that tall stature and blondness are by no means constant companions in the same person. Continuing, it says, as regards to our Anglo-Saxon stock, it is difficult to say whether the Englishman, Scotsman, Welshman, or Irishman has the greater degree of Nordic blood in his veins. The London Cockney, in part of the ancient Neolithic type, the Shanty, or Irishman of the west coast of Ireland, whose type is the Neanderthal, was discernible in certain individuals among the immigrants of the first great influx into America during the decade of the 40s, giving rise to the prevalent Irish caricature which erroneously survives. The dark small type of the Iberic Silurians, found among the Welsh, or the so-called black breed of Scotland, descended from the probably Iberian Picts, all seem to be survivals of primitive folks. Continuing, the author says countless invasions engraved the racial strains of our European ancestors, and yet it is true that certain race strains are still distinguishable without any question after centuries of admixture. He says today we find the Nordic race with, in general, a fair skin, tall stature, long face and skull, hair ranging from flaxen to shades of red and brown, and above all, it is the only subspecies of mankind in the world that boasts of light eyes of blue, green, or gray coloring. So this Nordic blood was supposed to qualify them as the master race, but he refers to them as a subspecies. Now, that's very telling. So let's dig a little deeper into this Nordic race and then see who their primitive ancestors were. Let's make sure we have a good understanding of this word subspecies. This is from Webster. A subspecies is a category in biological classification that ranks immediately below a species. Let that sink in. A subspecies ranks below a species. And now we'll read this from Tech Interactive. It tells us that scientists believe that the human species known as Homo sapiens evolved. And let's go ahead and correct that lie. They didn't evolve, they were created. But they say the reason they believe Homo sapiens began in Africa is because of both fossil and DNA evidence. Why? Because the oldest fossils are in Africa. It says the evidence point to Africa as the place where Homo sapiens first originated. Man was created in Africa. Here's food for thought. Why aren't they finding the Neanderthal bones in Africa if Homo sapiens were in Africa first? That tells you they had to have come from elsewhere. Genesis 6. I mean, really, that says it all right there. So the dark melanated people are the original, the master race. So as we delve into this information about this so-called Nordic or Germanic master race, I want you to keep that thought in mind and remember that a subspecies is a rank below a species. Now let's read some excerpts from this book written by John Kylingstad called Measuring the Master Race. It says the notion of a Germanic or Nordic race was a linchpin of Nazi ideology. The Nazis believed that this superior race had the right to extend their Lebensraum or living space at the expense of others. And they put this idea into practice with brutal efficiency. It was not the Nazis, however, who invented the concept of a superior Nordic Germanic race. In the early 20th century, it was common practice to rank humanity into inferior and superior races, and many saw the Nordic Germanic race as the pinnacle of humankind. This belief was particularly widespread in nations that were considered to be of Germanic origin, such as the US, England, Germany, and the Scandinavian countries. In all these countries, there were racial ideologues who held that humankind's progress would come to a halt unless the presumed master race was protected from racial mixing and allowed to expand at the expense of inferior races. You all, do you actually hear what this is saying? This supposed master race had the right to expand and take over the living area of others at their expense. That may explain why Trump is talking about taking over the space of other nations.
You know, I'm proud to have that German blood. There's no question about it. Great stuff.
Now, what's interesting is that they have no qualms about boasting about their heritage and bloodline. But when we do it, we're racist and we should walk in love. Go figure. But the article goes on to say that one important reason why the master race ideas were taken seriously by so many was because they claimed it was founded in scientific fact. Yeah, scientific fact. It says for centuries, European scholars believed that the Germanic-speaking nations of Northern Europe could trace their roots back to the Germanic tribes described in ancient Roman sources. And what do we know about those tribes? They were barbarians. This is during the 19th century, this historical notion of a Germanic people was transformed into a scientific concept of race. In numerous scientific publications, the Germanics were defined as a distinct type of human being, one characterized by a specific set of inheritable bodily traits such as blonde hair, blue eyes, a tall stature, and an elongated head shape. While this race was commonly referred to as Germanic throughout the 19th century, after the turn of the 20th, the label Nordic was usually favored. So Scandinavia was generally seen as the heartland and cradle of the Nordic race. Now it says, by imbuing the idea of the Nordic race with scientific legitimacy, these scholars also advanced its international recognition and acceptance. So let's see how Webster defines master race. It's a people held to be racially preeminent and hence fitted to rule or enslave other peoples. So they developed a concept of a supposed master race. The ideal was the Germanic or Nordic race. This information comes from the University of Chicago Press journals called Norwegian Physical Anthropology and the Idea of a Nordic Master Race. It says anthropologists used to consider Norway a homeland for the so-called Nordic or Germanic race, which many Europeans and Americans held to be a superior race. Well, why? Well, they deemed themselves to be superior because of certain physical characteristics, like the color of their skin, hair, eyes, and their tall stature. This says some North Europeans and North Americans even wanted to reorganize society in ways that would strengthen the reproduction and expansion of this blonde race to the detriment of other races. Now, hopefully, that will explain the mindset and behaviors of white supremacist groups. They believe that their race is the only worthwhile race, and they need to expand it. And what did that lead to? The eugenics movement. This says the spread of less worthy elements at the expense of valuable human material, and they consider themselves to be the valuable humans, had to be counteracted by public intervention in the biological reproduction of individual members of society. Apart from this common goal, eugenics was a very heterogeneous movement. The idea of improving the human race. They wanted to improve the human race. So it says it was not necessarily linked to the concept of races in the physical anthropological meaning of the word. Much eugenic thinking was concerned with the frequency of inherited traits for health and disease without much attention to racial classification. So hopefully you caught that. It was about survival. They were trying to protect the Nordic recessive genomes. It goes on to say the idea of a Nordic master race was part of Norwegian physical anthropology from its establishment as a discipline in the 1890s until the 1920s. Family, this racist ideology was still firmly entrenched in the 1920s. It says this changed from about 1930 when Alette and Christian Schreiner started arguing that this idea belonged on the scrap heap of outdated scientific concepts. Their change of attitude from indifference to condemnation seems to have been part of a trend among Norwegian scholars and scientists. So all of a sudden, they changed their mind and they said, oh, this idea belongs on the trash heap. But folks are still pretending that this happened a long time ago. No, some of these folks are still alive today. They are still alive and well today. Now, let's see how serious they were about this master race ideology. Some of you may have already heard about the Lebensborn program, but for those who may not have heard about it, I'm going to share some information from this history collection article entitled, Here's What to Know About Lebensborn, the Nazi Human Selective Breeding and Child Abduction Program. It says the Nazis believed in good blood. Isn't that what Trump talked about? That ought to be sought out, preserved, and expanded. And in bad blood, which was to be identified, then ruthlessly eradicated. I think you know which category we fell into according to them. So this Lebensborn program was referred to as the Spring of Life program, which went to bizarre and often sinister lengths in an attempt to increase the stock of what they call racially valuable Germanic children. It was partly a selective breeding program and partly a massive child kidnapping policy. This says, to say that the Third Reich were obsessed with race and racial purity would be an understatement. The SS implemented a program known as Lebensborn to increase the racially pure population by increasing the Aryan birth rate. They looked for unmarried, pure Aryan women who were matched with pure SS members. If the women conceived, they would move them into SS housing until they gave birth. The offspring were often adopted by pure Aryan families, particularly from the SS. That was Hitler's group. Continuing, it says when much of Europe came under German control during World War II, German occupiers were encouraged to breed with women from Nordic populations. This program was so successful that more Lebensborn children were born in Norway during just 5 years of German occupation than were born in Germany during the entire 10-year span of the program. Listen, it says another part of the Lebensborn program involved straightforward kidnapping of children. Were they serious or what? It says those who looked like pure Aryans were kidnapped by the hundreds of thousands from across Europe and taken to Germany, where they would be Germanized. So it's safe to say that a lot of people living today in Europe could be a child born into this program and not even know it. It goes on to tell us that eugenics was the pseudoscience behind the Lebensborn program. Eugenics advocated for lower rates of reproduction or the sterilization of people with undesirable traits, and higher rates of reproduction for those with desirable traits, or positive eugenics. This movement spread from Germany to Britain, and from there much of Europe, and across the Atlantic to Canada and the United States. And we know that they've certainly been working to lower our numbers. So they would actually have the children inspected and certified. This is a copy of the Eugenics certificate. This is just straight up evil. It says the program enabled unmarried pregnant women to mate with what they considered to be racially valuable men and to help them avoid being stigmatized. So they helped them give birth anonymously. It says about 60% of the mothers were unwed. Now let's consider that we're talking about Christian folk, Holy Roman Empire folk, encouraging fornication and babies being born out of wedlock. That's Christianity. But they love to publish the numbers of brown women giving birth out of wedlock. So if the babies were healthy, they were adopted. If they were not, they euthanized them. These people are the serpent's seed for sure. Now listen to this part. It says many of the newborns were baptized in bizarre SS occult ceremonies. Family, a lot of these people are still living today. They were baptized into occult ceremonies. This they don't talk about, but they will talk about voodoo in Haiti. Now it says the Nazis viewed the Scandinavians as an even more racially Nordic Aryan than were the Germans themselves. The breeding program in Norway proved even more fruitful than the German one. It says they ramped up the program by ordering that children meeting specified criterion of racial purity, listen, be abducted from German-occupied territories. So hundreds of thousands of children were snatched from their homes and off the streets in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Listen to their rationale. It says the assumption was that such children were of Germanic stock and thus too racially valuable to be left to waste in a sea of Slavs or other inferior races. They were to be repatriated to Germany and taken to Lebensborn homes. There, they were to be Germanized before getting put up for adoption alongside the offspring of the breeding portion of the program. The article says therein lay the seeds for what would eventually become a full-blown child kidnapping drive that spanned all of occupied Europe. Did you catch that? All of occupied Europe. It is estimated that over 400,000 children were abducted in this portion of the Lebensborn program. About half of the victims, roughly 200,000 children, were taken or kidnapped from Poland. Other significant sources included today's Belarus, from which about 30,000 children were abducted. The rest of the USSR furnished another 20,000 and roughly 10,000 were taken from Western and Southeastern Europe. Many were sent to a special government-run home where they were raised as virtual prisoners, and there is evidence of drug trials being carried out on them and their mothers. Guess who else had a hand in it? It says witnesses and documents indicate that the Norwegian military and Oslo University, perhaps at the behest of the CIA, conducted experiments on them using LSD, mescaline, and other drugs. Now, if this is what they do to their own, what wouldn't they do to our people? These people are demonically possessed. It says these people were eventually released in the early 60s. The early 60s, family. Now, the question is, where are all those people today? Let's take a look at this Time article. It's talking about the forgotten history of Nazi immigration to the U.S. It says Canada and the United States allowed and even encouraged the immigration of Nazi collaborators and Holocaust perpetrators in the years following the war. So Canada and the United States allowed and even encouraged the immigration of Nazi collaborators in the years following the war. The same people who were running such programs. But why wouldn't they? They're the same people. They are all the same people, family, even though some try to make it seem like they're not. Some will go as far as to say, well, they're Anglo-Saxons, the sons of Isaac. Have you heard that one? This article from Smithsonian delves into the many myths of the term Anglo-Saxon, basically saying that the term is being misused. It says people in the United States and Great Britain have long drawn on the imagined Anglo-Saxon heritage as an example of European whiteness. It points to how Teddy Roosevelt led his Rough Riders in the 1898 U.S. invasion of Cuba with a copy of a racist manifesto about Anglo-Saxon superiority. In the 1920s, it says, the Anglo-Saxon clubs of America lobbied in favor of segregation and argued for the exclusion of those with even a drop of any blood other than Caucasian. In the same time frame, a Baptist minister from Atlanta declared, the Ku Klux Klan is not fighting anybody. It is simply pro-Anglo-Saxon. Across the Atlantic in 1943, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill smugly inquired, why be apologetic about Anglo-Saxon superiority? That we were superior, that we had the common heritage which had been worked out over the centuries in England and had been perfected by our Constitution. Do you think they're proud of their ancestry? Absolutely. And that's why we should have no qualms about being proud of ours. We are the seed of Jacob. It says the few uses of Anglo-Saxon in Old English seem to be borrowed from the Latin Angli-Saxons. Manuscript evidence from pre-conquest England reveals that kings used the Latin term almost exclusively in Latin charters, legal documents, and for a brief period in their titles, such as the Anglorum Saxonum Rex, or King of the Anglo-Saxons. The references describe kings like Alfred and Edward, who did not rule, nor claim to rule, all the English kingdoms. They were specifically referring to the English Saxons from the continental Saxons. Scholars have no evidence of anyone before 1066 referring to themselves as an Anglo-Saxon in the singular or describing their politics and traditions as Anglo-Saxon. While one might be king of the English Saxons, nobody seems to have claimed to be an English Saxon. In other words, it says, who then were the groups that lend Anglo-Saxon its name? The Angles were one of the main Germanic peoples from modern-day southern Denmark and northern Germany to settle in Great Britain. So no, it does not mean Isaac's sons. Can we just say here that Isaac was not an Israelite? He was Jacob's father. Jacob was renamed Israel, not Isaac. Let's keep going. It goes on to say that both American and English writers have rebranded Anglo-Saxon to include false narratives around white racial superiority. And it certainly does not mean that they are the chosen people because they are sons of Isaac. So it goes on to say even Thomas Jefferson perpetuated the Anglo-Saxon myth as a kind of racial prophecy of white conquest, envisioning early settlers as the continuation of their European forebears. It says the entire settler colonial narrative has always centered on white people migrating to the Americas, just as the German tribes migrated to the British Isles. So just to be clear, who are we talking about? These are the nations Messiah prophesied about here in Luke 21:24, who would be trampling Jerusalem down in the last days. They would enslave the people of the Most High and traffic them around the world with yokes of iron upon their necks, and then act like they did them a favor. We're talking about the Gentile nations from Daniel's vision, the legs of iron and the 10 toes. You have to know who they are and how they work against us. So no, we cannot unite and come together around a bed of lies just because they say they're Christians. Need I remind you that the slave masters were Christians? Many of them were preachers. We have to rebuke the liars and call them out. Serpents hide. Tares look like wheat. Judas will pretend to believe the same as you, but they're beholden to massa. They will work with massa to offer incentives to get you to soften your stance against them. The goal is to stop you from saying things that offend them. They will offer access and larger platforms when you promote an agenda of inclusivity. But I tell you that the sword is here to divide. Truth will cause division. Let me remind you that the Gentiles who joined the early believers were one with them initially. And when the attacks came from the Romans, many of them joined in with their own people. So don't be in despair when trials come. The tests will show you who people really are. Pray for the fire of heaven to chase them out of their holes and into the open. Again, some of them, not all of them. I'm not saying that some won't come to know our Father and be genuine. I've said repeatedly, there are some who will be like Rahab, but her actions spoke for her. Faith without works is dead, and you can know them by their fruit. But it takes time to see good fruit. It will not happen overnight. People know how to talk a good game. Family wisdom and discernment is paramount in this hour to know who is for us and who is against us. And please hear me when I say this. Don't rely on color. There are greased palms of many colors, so you'll have to be led by the Ruach. There is more to cover as we go on to talk about the fourth beast, his religion, and his people. Be sure to join me for that. But if this message has been a blessing to you, please hit the like and share it. You're also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. We normally upload messages on Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Yah willing. Join me next time.